never had a fair shot. All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined here in the Left of Black studios at the John Hope Franklin Center by Professor Claudia Milian, who is Associate Professor of Romance Studies here at Duke University and the author of the new book, Latining America, Black, Brown Passages and the Coloring of Latino Studies. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well.
Thanks for joining us. This new book, University of Georgia Press, and you talk throughout the book about trying to really open up the space of Latino studies by bringing into bear, you know, what African Americanness is, what blackness is. Talk a little bit about how you got to this book and what you were trying to do with it.
Sure. As you pointed out, it's very much about deciphering in many ways what the meaning of Latino is, both in literary and cultural practices, but also questioning how this economy of blackness, brownness, and dark brownness also applies to African Americanness, and so in forms of embodied identity. And how I got to this book essentially was accidental, in the sense that I was in graduate school, and I realized that a lot of the things that interested me in the context of African American literature was always how this Mexican or Spaniard or Puerto Rican or ambiguous Latin would show up in African American literature in the marginalia, and I couldn't really, I wanted to know more. What are the dynamics that are happening here? And that sort of led me to all these different kinds of questions that I explored in the book. But in sort of doing that kind of investigation, what I'm also interested in is trying to see how these kinds of dual directional passing lines or crossing lines culturally and at the level of, I guess, racial signification, also moves both fields to talk in a more dynamic and interrelated way.
I mean, talk a little bit about this, you know, definition of what is Latina, what is Latino. I mean, you say it very early in the book that's really one of the goals that you're trying to open up. And even as we think about that in the literary realm and the cultural realm, you know, when we look at it in terms of questions around public policy, right? When we look at it in terms of popular media, what it really becomes is a phrase in which we throw all kinds of Spanish-speaking people into one box. Race often gets erased in that context. You know, African Americanness gets erased within that context. You know, how do we work through this idea of trying to show a broader public just how diverse, you know, what you refer to as Latinities, right? You know, what exactly that is in terms of talking about that diverseness of experience, diverseness of bodies, diverseness of geography, in which we can't really put all these bodies and cultures and experiences into one space.
Sure. I think, you know, strategically, of course, there has to be, in many respects, this Latino thing, if you will, precisely because it has very real-world implications.
Like there's a black thing,
exactly.
Right? That we need, right.
So there's a community of signifiers that, of course, I understand, and I myself, I'm informed by and claim a political Latina identity. How it comes about in the book, more readily, it's about how, for me, Latino-ness is an ambiguity. It's a process of becoming, it's a process of being deracinated in the United States. I came here when I was 7 years old. I was born in El Salvador, and these kinds of questions for me is about how did I relate this invisible Salvadoran-ness, given that Latino identity is very much informed by Chicano-ness, Puerto Rican-ness, and Cuban-American-ness. So that element
Caribbean-ness, right?
Caribbean-ness, that element of invisibility, or Southwest Caribbean in many respects. And so, you know, I grew up in northern New Jersey, the northern New Jersey that Junot Diaz presents, Berkeley Avenue, Union City, West New York. And that's just a melange of Chileans, or just Cold War migrations come to life. And that made so much sense to me precisely because I had no one way of pinpointing what a singular Latino identity entailed.
Yeah. And I mean, because part of what you're talking about, you know, when you talk about the invisibility of folks from Central America, but then there's the hyper presence of Cuban Americans, the hyper-presence of Mexican Americans, right? And who gets lost in that, right? When we talk about it in a regional context, sure, where a Dominican or Puerto Rican experience kind of dominates our sense of who's there on the East Coast in places like New York and New Jersey, you're really talking about opening up the space then.
Oh, sure, and also the spaces through which we study all these conditions in terms of the academy. I couldn't imagine. I think it's a sort of it's the very unhousability of Latino is what attracts me too.
I like that, right? You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Claudia Milian, who is a professor of Romance Studies here at Duke University, authored a new book, Latining America, Black, Brown Passages, and the Coloring of Latino Studies. You break the book down in 4 chapters, and in the opening chapter is around this idea of Southern Latinities. And in particular, you talk about this distinction between the local South and the global South. Can you talk a little bit about those distinctions?
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons I came here to Duke was precisely because of the location of the South and how it sort of interrelates and mingles with this larger global South. But the local South, if you will, the new South, yeah, our South, is in many respects already a global one. There's no one South, right? And so the idea that interested me was how do I locate this Latino-ness within a geographic space that is very much informed and grounded by this black-white coupling. How do we sort of look at the ways through which this particular black-white South and Southwest, Southeast, Southwest dichotomies have also been interrelated. And I think, for instance, in the book I deal both with Langston Hughes and James Weldon Johnson, in the ways through which, if we think of James Weldon Johnson, his Florida, Georgia, and of course he became more of a metropolitan or cosmopolitan New York subject, and Langston Hughes with his migrations through Texas and Mexico, I think that allowed me some more context and malleability by which to sort of explore how Southern significations also run through the Latinity or Latin spaces that I'm dealing with.
You write about the work of Evelio Grillo, and his autobiography about growing up, Black and Cuban. You describe him, in one section of the book as, as a nod to James Weldon Johnson, but the extra colored man. and talk a little bit about what that would have meant for him, growing up in the early to mid 20th century. You mentioned that he also was a college student at Xavier University, right? And Xavier is an odd space, right? It's the only Black and historically Black and Catholic university in the country. So talk a little bit about his work and how his work informed what you're doing around this idea of Southern Latinities.
Sure. With Evelio Grillo, his autobiography is part of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage with Arte Publica Press. And so what interests me about that book was precisely the title, Black Cuban, Black American. And coming from Ybor City, which is a cigar-making historically, I guess, city that Jose Marti, the Pan-American thinker, went through. And his life informs part of these kind of labor migrations that aren't necessarily tied to the migrations we know now in terms of Castro politics and post-1959 revolutionary migrations. But with Grillo, is that very, the duality of this kind of Latinness and Blackness that walks through. And his education, starting even from high school, very much had to do with this particular Black literary and intellectual thought formation. And so what was fascinating to me was the elements of this kind of Black Latinness that doesn't get acknowledged. It was more this sort of, it becomes more assimilated into Blackness, to the point, as I mentioned in the book, that his own mother, whose name translates to I protect in English, her name is Amparo, becomes this really firm figure that to him was never really domestic. The more comforting presence was by a Black woman. And I was really struck by that because it's a sort of new biographical formation of a subject that is moving somewhere else. Those were the kinds of richness that interested me.
And even in that context, think about Xavier again for a second. I mean, particularly at that point in time, I mean, there's only special kind of Negroes that are going to someplace. Like, I mean, you had to look the part. you know, this was still an institution on some levels was doing their version of a paper bag test, you know, well into the 60s and the 70s. So even in that regard, you know, he's performing a certain kind of blackness, but it's also a very specific blackness to that region.
Indeed. You know, and just to relate it to other HCBUs, what also interests me is, well, how many versions of this kind of blackness have also been assimilated? If we think about Howard, or the ways through which that kind of narrative of blackness is being recovered or uncovered in many respects. So,
you're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here today with Professor Claudia Milian, who is the author of the new book, Latining America, Black, Brown Passages and the Coloring of Latino Studies. One of the terms that you threw out, or really kind of a theoretical framework, is talking about the ways that Latino identities is complicated by what you describe as blackness, dark brownness, and brownness. Talk a little bit about what those three different things mean.
So one of the ways that the book addresses this is by saying, well, within the popular imagination, blackness is ascribable only to U.S. African Americanness, and brownness to Latino identity. And you see this in so many books about black-brown conflict or black-brown solidarity. And what I wanted to do, or what I do in the book rather, is look at, sure, let's see how these two things blend over and cross over into one another. But I'm interested also in the economy of dark brownness. And what I do in chapter 3, for instance, is look at how some Latino autobiographers talk about some kind of dark brownness or blackness within the domestic sphere in the privacy of their own home. But all of a sudden, somewhere along their text, there's a rupture into this kind of public brownness. And for me, the question is, what happens to this dark brownness that sort of lingers? What is this kind of affect that stays there? So within that context, one could say, I think that this black, brown, dark brown economy in relationship to both Latino and African Americanness pretty much subscribe to the same, I guess, under the lens of my book, a Latin world of difference.
You're really offering an opportunity to open up not only Latino studies, but obviously African American studies, diaspora studies. You know, have you gotten any pushback in framing, say, James Weldon Johnson and looking at his memoir Along This Way, or the writings of Langston Hughes Around the Red Sea? You know, have you had to deal with any pushback around framing these quintessential Harlem Renaissance figures in a much broader, you know, international context, if you will, right? And often when we hear international context, we're thinking about Pan-Africanism, right? We're thinking about, you know, the trips that, you know, both of these figures would have taken to Europe and places like that. We're not thinking about Mexico or Venezuela or places like that.
That's a great point, Mark. Thank you. I guess the kinds of questions, you know, because the autobiography of an ex-colored man, for instance, was written when James Weldon Johnson was a consul to Venezuela and Nicaragua, and that is all essentially that you'd read. I was interested in, well, what happened there? I mean, this is how this figure is being created in Central America, which gets overlooked in so many ways since it's usually seen as a cultural desert. But so that really fascinated me. I was just at a gathering last week, and someone mentioned about Langston Hughes's crossings into Spain in relationship to baseball, and in Cuba too. So there's so many other things that you know, because I couldn't really move in that direction, those were the things that sort of had to happen to end the chapter. You know, with that deals with Hughes and James Weldon Johnson, that stopped there. But it would be interesting to see how else it gets picked up.
I'm struck by the fact, and you mentioned thinking about James Weldon Johnson as kind of a cosmopolitan figure. But so much of this work really, I think, is also in conversation of the work of someone like Achille Mbembe and this idea of being Afropolitan, you know, that's Africans of the world. I mean, you're really talking about what it means to be Latino in the world. Yes,
yes, and what this means in the world of letters and culture, to have this huge international level of articulation and signification and how it pops up. Ultimately, I think that's also what's very, very provocative about the Harlem Renaissance, about how global it was. And I think we're only sort of seeing how many scholars are excavating that and sort of seriously engaging with all the dimensions that even Harlem posited in terms of the population, the geography of it.
Yeah, you know, recently we taped a segment with a couple of historians, one of them, DeVarian Baldwin, have a collection, Escape from New York, which really is about opening up the space about how we think about the Harlem Renaissance, you know, in that context. It's not just something that's rooted in New York, not really even something that's just rooted in the U.S. You end the book in the epilogue with a figure that arguably might be the most recognizable, one of the most recognizable Latina subjects, at least in U.S. culture, other than like Jennifer Lopez, right? And I mean, you can almost make the argument that Jennifer Lopez's derriere is almost its own separate subject in that regard. But Dora the Explorer, right? You know, this confection, if you will, of PBS that for many folks, you know, becomes a kind of introduction to Latino culture. And folks respond to Dora the Explorer in very complicated kinds of ways. I mean, this is a, you know, a little Mexican-American girl, we think, because we don't know where she lives, you know, who's running the countryside, you know, with clothes that don't fit, and a monkey in red boots. Boots, right? You know, talk a little bit about the kind of labor that Dora does and how you think about Dora in the context of the work that you're doing.
Sure. It was interesting, and this happened because I was at a Target, and this little girl was saying phrases in Spanish, and her monolingual white American mother didn't know what she was saying. And it was just
you're trying to figure out how that happened.
It was just a very basic term. And I'm also conscious of, or I'm interested in how Dora may have a different meaning when she's translated into Spanish in the Hispanophone world, or even Spain. But that aside, I think, and I do not watch Dora, but it's just, I saw a couple of episodes.
I don't want to say unfortunately, but I've spent hundreds of hours watching Dora, more than I'd like to claim that I have.
Okay, so you can fill me in.
Yes.
But what's fascinating about Dora, I think, is in terms of what it also represents, you know. So one of the things, and thank you so much for being inclusive, when you mentioned this other part of the title of Latin America, the coloring of Latino, Latina studies, right? So, but that has a slash, and to me that reads Latino-a. And so what I realized at the end of the book, I also end with the @ sign in terms of being inclusive of these genders, Latinat, if you will. So with Dora, I mentioned that because with Dora, it's an explorer that moves all over the globe. We don't know exactly where she's from. And to me, what is more provocative there is where she's at and the kinds of new peer groups that she accumulates along the way. I like the fact that her identity is an explorer, that she's a little girl with a backpack. And I know some people would feel more comfortable with Dora having a particular nationality. I mentioned earlier when we started that for me Latino identity is profoundly one that is marked by deracination. I am very much a deracinated subject without a particular nationality, in the sense that yes, I'm Salvadoran, but I've learned to be Salvadoran away from El Salvador. And so for me, what's really compelling about sort of what is there behind Dora the symbol is precisely this possibility of new Latinness along the way.
I mean, you mentioned the precursor to Dora, you know, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? It's like that whole idea of this Latina subject, you know, who's not rooted in one place and really is global, right, in a real sense of the word.
But that's the irony of Dora too, because when I was thinking about it, I was trying to also conceptualize what else is there, and what does it mean if Dora is the one cartoon that sort of the non-real life thing that sort of encapsulates what I'm thinking about.
What's next for you?
Another book. I'm thinking a lot about environmental thought, and I'm seriously thinking about global Latino identities in translation, and exploring the idea of denationalizations and deracination further.
We've been joined today by Professor Claudia Milian, who's a professor of Romance Studies here at Duke University, author of the new book, Latining America, Black and Brown Passages in the Coloring of Latino Latina Studies, University of Georgia Press. Thanks for joining us today, Claudia.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to have you as an interlocutor. Thank you, Mark.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. Happy New Year. We're joined today by writer and director Chaunesti Webb. We're also joined by Lakeshia Coffey, who is an actress, both here from the Triangle region. We're here to talk about this play, I Love My Hair. This is the remix. The play originally launched in 2012, broke all kinds of records at the Manbites Theater which said a great deal both about, you know, Black women, but also the fact that there's a community out there that's willing to support great Black art. And so now you're doing a remix. So tell us a little bit about the remix. So tell us a little bit about the original play.
Sure.
And what's happening now with the remix of I Love My Hair.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having us here today. We started, I started this project back in 2008, 2009, when I was in graduate school at Naropa University. And when I finished and moved back to Durham, it was something that I knew that I wanted to continue working on. I've been doing a bunch of different interviews and talking to lots of different women, doing workshops and just trying on different material and sound and movement. And so when 2012 came around and we, you know, had pieced this project together and shared it with the community, we were so incredibly overwhelmed with the response. I mean, I don't know that, maybe they expected that would happen, but I certainly did not expect.
You know, I had the chance to see it twice. You know, one time with my wife, another time with my then 14-year-old daughter. And it was just amazing to me to see the range of folks that were there. I mean, there's always this narrative that, you know, if it's not Tyler Perry, right?
Exactly.
Or something along those lines, that Black folks don't support theater, first of all, let alone Black art in general. And I think it showed that, you know, when you do a great production that really speaks to the values of the community, that the community will come out and support
Absolutely. I think there's a niche for it. And I certainly think that Durham, the Triangle area, and we had folks who were coming from, you know, beyond Granville County, Mecklenburg County. So we really did reach a lot of folks within this region. And so I think they spoke. I think not only African American communities, but very, very diverse communities throughout North Carolina, I think, really showed up to support. Because the reality of it, I think the story, we address a lot of these issues of race and class and sexuality and identity through the lens of hair and the Black female, Southern female experience, I think. But there's so much about it that's life and human experience that really reached people who were not part of our
community. Lakeshia, you've been involved with the project since 2010. What's it like watching it go through these very different development stages, particularly with the 2012 launch, and now as you're on the brink of launching the remix, you know, which opens at the Manbites Theater here in Durham on January 16th?
Well, I did mention about last week, I believe it was, that this project has truly been a labor of love. This is one of the fewer shows that I've ever had the opportunity to be a part of the creative process. So the workshops that Chaunesti mentioned, I was a part of those. And when we listened to the script the first time, took me back to just being in a room with women, discussing our upbringing, how we interact day to day at work, and you don't realize how relative your story is to everybody else until you hear what their story is too. So.
We're here with actress Lakeshia Coffey, as well as writer, director, and also actor Chaunesti Webb, talking about the new play, I Love My Hair, the remix, which opens at the Manbites Dog Theater on January the 16th of this year here in Durham, North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the differences between the original version that opened in 2012 and now the remix.
I think one obvious difference is that we've all grown. It's been, what, a year, 2 years almost, that we have been away from the work. And so the I think experiences that we brought to the table have really enriched the current work that we're engaged in. I also spent a lot of time sort of trimming off some of the fat and tightening up the writing and some of the storylines and narratives throughout the piece that I felt were maybe a bit weak or needed some enhancement the first time around. It's been quite a gift to have a do-over, I'd say. But because this project is in process, and I hope to at some point be able to take it on the road to do some touring, we're still sort of working some things out. We also have an entirely new musical score that's been done by singer-songwriter, composer Shauna Tucker.
Shout out, Shauna. How you doing?
And she's been a really dear friend and worked on the early project, the early version of the project, sort of curating music. And so we've got an original sound score that she's worked on together with another local artist, Emily Mussolino. Another shout out to Emily, who's been really fantastic to redevelop this work. We also have been working with Aya Shabu, who was our original choreographer, who has come back in and sort of, developed some new pieces, enhanced existing movement moments in the play. So I think it's just folks who've seen it before will see a lot of familiar
changes, some of the changes,
work, but a lot of new material. And it feels like a different show because the configuration of the space is much different. It's a thrust. So there's seating on 3 sides of the stage. So it's a lot more intimate.
Lakeshia, you're just finishing up a run with The Best of Enemies, which tells this great, dorm story about C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater. What's it like to transition, from that particular space, which is about this really heavy but also fantastic story about the civil rights era here in Durham, to transition to something that someone might argue is closer to home in terms of you and your hair?
Well, I appreciate the transition because it shows that there are so many different stories out there in touch with our community that are being told now. The Best of Enemies was a totally different kind of show for me, for the fact that we actually had hands-on experience to talk with the people that we're portraying.
Right, C.P. Ellis and
right.
Ann Atwater. Yeah.
So, and having them in the audience to watch us portray their story, and it's so much pressure to do it right because aside from the fact that they're there, it's a genuine story and you want to give it the respect and the care that it needs. So the transition from that into this, like I said, I appreciate it because I go from being this powerful, robust woman who has so much, influence in the community to telling a story about someone who really doesn't know who she is and is growing to try to find that out. So I'm overjoyed.
One of the things you did, Chaunesti, when I Love My Hair opened in 2012, is that you did a lot of community-based events. Talk about what your plans are this time around with the remix.
Yeah. So part of the reason why I decided to do the show again was very much as Lakeshia mentioned, this has been a labor of love. It's for me been about giving back to my community in all of the different ways that can happen. And I really wanted to make sure that there were folks who got a chance to see this who did not have a chance to experience it before. And so one of the things that we've done, we have been engaged in this sort of collecting childhood photos. And so we have this bit that happens at the beginning of the show where we will be displaying them. I don't want to give too much away. And so we've been collecting women's photos, funny, hair moments, funny or sort of loving moments between young girls and their family members or friends. And it's becoming this real sweet collage, like a family album almost that we're constructing. And so we've had lots of women from around our community submitting work. So we've got that. We're also doing an event on January the 18th at Manbites Dog Theater from 11 to 2. I Love My Hair, I Love My Body, which is going to be an opportunity for women to come together and hear some presentations from folks in the wellness profession, also some stylists who can help us to look at ways that we can take care of our hair, whether we're natural or whether we're straight. Because one of the things we learned in our work was that an obstacle to wellness and taking care of ourselves, that self-care piece for Black women in particular, sometimes is hair. Women say they don't get active because of their hair, and so we want to be supportive in offering some additional information around how that can happen.
It's my daughters are competitive. So both my daughters are competitive swimmers, but my oldest is particularly serious about it. And one of the reasons why we were able to get her engaged in the sport because at a very young age, she didn't hold on to her hair that way. And we hear these stories over and over again, not just in terms of fitness, but in particularly in terms of swimming, of Black women who don't make those kind of options, right, for a healthier lifestyle because it comes down to, I spent a whole lot of money last week. and I think even more importantly, I spent a whole lot of time last week. I mean, there's, you spending 12 hours, between waiting and then actually having your hair worked right. It is a time-consuming and financially constraining experience. What is it about Black women's hair that, and is this something that we really see in other communities, right? What is it about a Black woman's experience in her hair that dictates so much of the time and energy that it does?
I wish I could answer that because I, growing up was also a competitive. I ran track.
Yeah.
So I had to go through some of the same things of figuring out how I'm going to do my hair, because in high school, identity is everything.
Yeah.
You want to be
Right.
part of the popular crowd. You want to be accepted, and you got to look the part in order for that to happen. So I went through quite a few transitions as well. My solution was to cut all my hair off. So if I didn't have a lot to deal with, I could keep it up a little bit better. So that was mine. On the 18th, we'll be able to find out more options.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by actress Lakeshia Coffey. Just recently of the play at the Manbites Dog Theater, The Best of Enemies, which tells the story of C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater here in Durham, North Carolina. We're also joined by Chaunesti Webb, writer, director, actor, and of course, she's the creator and director of the new play, I Love My Hair, the remix.
The remix. Yeah.
So, what are you hoping after this, Chaunesti? I know you said you'd like to go on tour and be able to tour the piece. And I mean, when, for those folks who are fortunate to bring their 7 or 8 year old daughter, to see the play. I mean, what are you hoping that they leave, what particularly young folks are leaving with?
Well, that's been really important to me that even in some of the revisions that I made, not that it was, I think the content does involve some mature themes that require some dialogue between parents or guardians with young people. But even in the language, I tried to sort of make some adjustments because I wanted to make it as accessible as possible to all ages of young girls. I really hope that it is a place to begin some dialogue, to have some conversation about things that we don't talk about. I mean, even within our community, we all know that there's the sort of colorism that happens. We all know the language around good hair, bad hair, but when it really comes to the heart conversations about those things, it's more difficult for us to have those, which is one of the things that we found when we all came together as adult women. None of us had ever said aloud a lot of the things that we were able to say, and some of the things that I think are said in the show. So I hope that young girls who come have a chance to see themselves in some way, to know that they're not alone, and to perhaps find some pride in whatever it is that they have that's uniquely them.
I want to throw this out for you. I mean, you think about media depictions these days, right? And so, Olivia Pope is, Kerry Washington's character is one of the most popular characters on television, Black woman. You look at a Michelle Obama, right? You look at the last year of Beyonce Noel Carter's life. This is a Black woman who performs at the inauguration and literally walks off that stage to perform at the Super Bowl, right? We've never seen anything like that. How do we compare these kind of very big images of Black women, right? We can throw Oprah into the mix and a few other people, to what everyday Black girls and Black women have to do, the kind of microaggressions that come with being Black women. How do we balance these very big celebratory images with what is the reality of living a life as a Black woman or a Black girl on an everyday basis?
Well, I would say that's where this storytelling comes in. This sort of, in your community, in your hometown, in your neighborhood, when you're able to see other Black women who look like we look. I mean, we come in all shapes and sizes and shades and natural hair, relaxed hair. I think that's when people like us are important in some of that modeling, so that young girls know that they have other options. They don't always have to look like Olivia Pope or Beyonce or Michelle Obama. Those women, I highly respect those women for the work that they do, but I feel like there are lots of other options and models.
What's next for you, Lakeshia?
Next for me is Spirits to Enforce back at Manbites Dog. So I'm living there this season.
What's it like to have a vibrant community theater like Manbites Dog? You know, first of all, just to have it there, but also being so open to the presence of Black women and Black men, you know, showing their talents.
It's, I think, necessary.
Yeah.
Because not too many areas, you know, within the Triangle and outside, give Black men and women the opportunity.
Hell, you know, in America
right.
these days,
you
right?
know, so to have somewhere to go, to have a space where they understand and appreciate outside of what our skin tone looks like.
I remember having a conversation, it's almost 20 years ago, with Amir Baraka, and it was around the time that Spike Lee's Malcolm X came out, and Baraka had some criticisms. And he always said something to me that has stayed with me for a long time, that it would be better just to create our own original art in a basement, you know, where 20 people can see it, than actually think that we can actually control our images in these broader kind of corporate settings, right? And I think the value of what you've done with I Love My Hair is that it's created this very intimate community situation where folks can come in. It's a safe space, right? It's a space for us to be thoughtful about ourselves, but also to let love and critique ourselves in very loving ways. And both of you are obviously to be commended for the work that you're doing with this. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, I'm your host, Left of Black. We've been joined today by actress Lakeshia Coffey. We've also been joined by Chaunesti Webb, writer, director, creator of the new play, I Love My Hair, the remix, which opens at the Manbites Dog Theater January 16th in Durham, North Carolina. Thanks for joining us.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything, everything.